Hi, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Well, it's winter in the South. Temperature has dropped below freezing at night, and so I'm in a long sleeve flannel shirt because I don't want to freeze to death. Today, I want to talk about two things. One is the need to get a second opinion, and the second is why it is never a good idea to act as your own attorney. I'll have more on that in just a moment. So early on, after I graduated from law school and finished a clerkship at the Missouri Supreme Court, I was hired by a plaintiff's firm in Overland Park, Kansas. And I went to work for them. Um, I was there for about 3 years. And we didn't part on really amicable terms, but at least one of the lawyers later on came back and said, you know what, I think we made a mistake when we let you go, and I appreciated that. But the fact of the matter is, they were really good lawyers when it came to medical malpractice and to product liability. But like a lot of lawyers, they had developed a kind of tunnel vision about what kinds of cases they would take and what kinds of risks they would take with regard to cases. So I guess my first year there, toward the end of my first year there, a man came in with a very good case against a company that had essentially forced him out of business. It was a commercial case, and although I no longer remember all of the exact details, I do remember that I was very interested in pursuing the case. So I wrote up a memo and I pitched it to the partners in that law firm, and they decided that it was not a case, that it wasn't something that could be won, and so we should decline the case. Well, I did not think that was a good idea, but I was an associate, I wasn't a partner, so I carried out that direction. But when I carried out the direction, I called the client and I said, look, this is just one lawyer's opinion here. You need to go get a second opinion on this case because I think it could have merit. You just need to find the right lawyer to try it. So he was somewhat upset that they weren't going to represent him, and he was really upset with me, even though all I was the person who was giving him that information. To make a long story short, about 18 months later, I was going through the jury verdict reporting service, and there was that client sitting on a $600,000 verdict against the people he had wanted to sue. And I made sure to circle that jury verdict when it got circled and sent around to all of the other lawyers so that everybody could see, hey, I was right. That may be one of the reasons why they let me go. I don't know. But I thought that was interesting and important. And so I offer that to people who have been denied, who have gone to a lawyer and the lawyer says, you don't have a case. Usually a lawyer will not tell you, look, you don't have a case. Usually what a lawyer will say is, this case isn't right for us. We don't think that we could get a jury verdict. Something like that. Because when you say you don't have a case, it essentially can foreclose somebody from going to get a second opinion. So one of the things that we have always done, or I've always done in decline letters, is tell people, look, you need to go get another opinion because this is just one lawyer's opinion. And another lawyer might have a different opinion and might very well be able to help you. And I think that frequently that does happen if people go get a second opinion. So that's item number one for today. If you have been denied by a lawyer who said you don't have a case or we're not going to take your case, don't stop. If you believe you've been wronged and you believe the other side is wrong, get a second opinion, always. You'll always be glad you did. So there is an old saw about the difference between a fairy tale and a war story. A fairy tale starts off once upon a time, and a war story starts off, you're not going to believe this, but. So you're not going to believe this, but. The second thing I wanted to share, which is also sort of in the form of a war story, is that it is never a good idea to represent yourself. Now, we've seen that with the Darrell Brooks case, right? I mean, it's been pretty clear that he did a terrible job of representing himself. Frankly, I don't think anybody could have represented him and gotten a better deal for him or gotten a better result for him. His crime was simply too horrific. There were too many people killed. There were too many people injured, and the impact on the community was simply too great. So, my view on that is he probably didn't do any worse in the long run than even the best lawyer in Wisconsin would have done for him. But be that as it may, I have a war story that explains why that, I have two actually war stories that explain why that's a bad idea. So the first one, I had a case involving a rent and possession action. Part of what I did at my law firm in Missouri was some poverty law. I would go and help people who could not afford another attorney. And I went to a case in the Associate Circuit Court in Monroe County, and instead of hiring a lawyer, a landlord had come into landlord court to represent himself. And unfortunately, while he had prevailed in the first instance, when you appeal something like that, which is what our client did, it goes to what's called a trial de novo. And instead of it being a simplified legal procedure where the rules of evidence do not apply, it gets elevated to a formal legal procedure where the rules of evidence do apply. And that means the rules of how you question a witness and how you admit a document. And if you don't know the questions to ask or the things to say to get documents admitted, then you're not going to get them admitted. So at the beginning of this case, the judge said, look, I will give you another 10 days to go get a lawyer if you want to go get a lawyer. And the landlord was like, no, that costs too much, and I will never recover that back from this lady, and so I'll just go right ahead. So he said, okay, but you do so at your own risk. You understand that? Yeah, I understand that. So he gets up and he tries to admit the lease, and I object. And he can't overcome those objections. So the first thing he does is he calls my client as his first witness. And my client gets on the stand and he starts off with, you were a tenant in my house, correct? And I object because that's a leading question. It suggests the answer. Objection leading. And the judge sustained the objection. And then he looked at the judge and said, what's that mean? He said, it means you can't ask that question. So how can I ask that question then? The judge said, I can't advise you. That's why you needed a lawyer. And at every turn, almost everything that he tried to get in front of the court, he couldn't do because he did not know how. The $100 or $200 that he would have spent on a lawyer would have gotten him probably a $500 or $600 verdict. So yeah, he might not have gotten the full recovery, but he got a lot more recovery than he would have gotten a lot more recovery than he got at trial because essentially he couldn't get anything in and his case failed. And as a result, my client did not have to pay anything. And for the record, I wasn't representing somebody who didn't deserve to be represented. The place that he was renting to people was literally a hovel and unfit to house human people. But fortunately, we never got to that issue simply because he never made his case. So that was the first reason. The best and one of the best reasons not to represent yourself in court, particularly if you're not a lawyer, is that you don't know what you don't know. So the second case, we had a couple in our neighborhood who were, shall we say, unequipped to live in the neighborhood. They liked to have loud, wild parties on their front lawn in the summer that lasted till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And those of us who actually worked, we were somewhat put off by the idea of listening to loud music at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And we would call the police, and the police would come out, and they'd turn off the music while the police were there. And 5 minutes later, after the police were gone, they'd turn the music right back up. Well, we went through this for quite some time, and eventually we got together and filed a lawsuit. But before we filed a lawsuit, the ex-wife of the male in that operation had filed a custody action against the male in that action because he was essentially abusing his child. And one of the ways in which he abused his child was to send him outside to play when the weather was 25 degrees in nothing but a t-shirt and a pair of shorts. And I had seen that. I had told the lady when I bumped into her at the courthouse that I thought this was bad and that she ought to know this. And so she included that in her custody action. And she called me as a witness. And I testified that I had seen this and that it wasn't good for the child. So he decided to represent himself at this. And as soon as her lawyer sat down after he had asked me questions, he jumped up and said, "You don't have any health care training, do you?" I said, "Yes, I'm a registered respiratory therapist." "Well, you're not a doctor." I said, "No, I'm not a doctor. I work for a living," which is something we said in the hospital, and it wasn't really meant to disparage doctors. It was just something funny that we said. And it made the poor judge just laugh out loud. And at that point, it became pretty clear that the young man was not going to prevail on his fight in this custody issue. So after I got off the stand, the judge reached his decision, and the young man said, "Well, I'm going to file an appeal." And he said, "Well, you're going to do that from jail." And the guy said, "What? What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, you have a warrant out for your arrest." So the bailiff came up and slapped the handcuffs on him and took him away to the county jail. Another good reason not to represent yourself is that you don't know what you don't know, particularly if you have warrants out for your arrest. It's never a good idea to come into the courthouse because guess what? The warrants come out of the courthouse. So those are my 2 war stories for today, and hopefully you found them interesting, helpful, useful. If you have, you know what to do. Like, share, subscribe, all those things. Touch on the notification bell. I won't bore you any further with that. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, if you have children, you have to look out for them. Hold their hands when you're in a parking lot. I see all the time people letting children follow them into a store through a parking lot where there are cars driving. That is never a good idea. Just a safety tip for today. Thank you very much for watching. Have a terrific day.